I stood in the boardroom with the pen already resting between my fingers and every face around the table, watching me with that same quiet expectation, the kind that always appears when a man is about to hand over a legacy he spent his entire lifetime building, and I had told myself I was ready told. Myself, this was the right time, the right moment, the right decision. Told myself that passing the company to the one person who shared my blood was the natural order of things, and yet beneath all that practiced certainty, a small tightening had been growing inside my chest for weeks. A pressure I kept pushing aside, pretending it was just nerves, pretending it was just the weight of transition, pretending it had nothing to do with the look in my son's eyes. Whenever the subject came up, that strange flicker that didn't belong to him, and as the papers were slid across the polished table toward me and the room fell into a thick, expectant silence, I felt that pressure spike, sharp enough to cut through every prepared thought, and I hesitated just for a breath long enough for unease to rise up the back of my neck, and I told myself to ignore it. Told myself this was fatherhood, this was trust, this was the moment every parent works toward, but the hesitation wouldn't fade. It only grew heavier, and just as my hand lowered to sign, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a single vibration, sharp, precise, cutting straight through the tension in the room, and something in me froze, because no one should have been contacting me right now. Not during this, not at the exact second. I was about to give away everything I built, and I pulled the phone out, glancing at the screen expecting something routine, something irrelevant, but the preview of the message stopped, my breath cold. A single line from an unknown number, "Do not sign," and the words slammed into me so hard, the pen slipped slightly in my grip, and the room around me blurred into a distant hum, because warnings don't come like that without a reason. Warnings don't arrive at the exact second you need them, unless someone has seen something you haven't, and I excused myself, quickly stepping out into the hallway, the polished floors reflecting a distorted version of me as I read the message again, slower, this time each word sinking deeper until my pulse began to pound. And when the second message arrived, it was even worse. "He is being controlled," and I stood there, holding the phone so tightly, my knuckles ached, feeling the world I thought I understood tilt violently, because I had spent months ignoring the strange signs, ignoring the way my son avoided certain questions, ignoring the way he glanced at his phone before answering anything important, ignoring the way confidence flickered and died whenever she looked at him, ignoring the way his decisions had stopped sounding like his own and had begun sounding rehearsed, shaped, filtered through someone else's intentions. And I leaned against the wall, breathing slowly, trying to make sense of the way everything inside me began to unravel, because the pieces fit too neatly now. The rushed conversations, the sudden secrecy, the constant presence of someone who never looked at me directly, but at the future I could hand her. And I remembered the last dinner we had together, the way she answered questions meant for him, the way she squeezed his arm lightly whenever he spoke, as if directing him from the inside out, the way he parroted her ideas word for word with a stiffness that made something inside me twist. And now the warning made everything snap into clarity, and I wasn't ready for how much it hurt. The realization that my son, the boy I raised, the boy who used to run down the hallway calling my name, the boy who once begged me to teach him everything I knew, had become tangled in the influence of someone who saw him not as a leader, but as a doorway to something bigger, something richer, something she could claim through him. And I walked farther down the hallway, trying to steady myself, trying to keep the panic from rising too high, because this wasn't just about a company. This was about him, about the person he had become, about the fear I had seen, hidden behind his eyes, and pretended not to notice. And I kept remembering the way he asked me if I trusted him that night, weeks ago, his voice too thin, too brittle, too unsure to belong to a man ready to lead anything, and how she sat beside him watching me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And I realized the hesitation I felt in that boardroom wasn't doubt in him. It was the quiet instinct of a father who finally understood his son was not standing on his own. He was being held up by someone who cared more about control than about him. And the fear that swept through me wasn't for the business, it was for him, for the possibility that he had given someone access to his mind, his confidence, his decisions, his future, and didn't even realize he had lost pieces of himself in the process. And as my pulse hammered, I reread the messages again, the warnings stark and undeniable, and I felt the old protective instinct rise inside me, the same instinct that once made me stand between him and anything that threatened him, and I knew with a clarity that made my hands tremble that walking back into that room and signing those papers would not be an act of love, it would be an act of surrender, it would be giving everything to a shadow, tightening around him and calling it faith. And I closed my eyes, breathing through the sharp ache forming beneath my ribs, because nothing about this moment was what I imagined. Nothing about handing him the future felt right anymore. Nothing made sense except the certainty that something was terribly wrong, and as I lowered the phone, my reflection in the glass door looked older, smaller, almost hollowed by the truth I had been refusing to face. But beneath all that, fear, a decision had begun to form, cold, steady, immovable. I would not sign, not until I knew exactly who was standing behind my son and what they planned to do with everything he had spent his life preparing to inherit. And I turned back toward the boardroom, knowing every gaze inside would question me, knowing whispers would rise, knowing pressure would follow. But none of that mattered, because the message echoing through my mind had replaced every doubt with a single undeniable truth: he is being controlled, and I would not let that truth destroy him. I walked back toward the boardroom, but the walls felt narrower somehow, as if the building itself knew something had shifted beneath my feet, and every step echoed too loudly in the silence, like the sound was warning me not to move forward, not to pretend nothing had changed, not to return to the table. Where everyone waited for a signature I suddenly knew would destroy more than it built, and when I reached the doorway, I paused just long enough to see my reflection in the glass, the tension in my shoulders, the unsettled look in my eyes, the way my hand still trembled slightly from the message that had stopped everything, and I turned away from the room before anyone could see the fear rising inside me, and walked farther down the hallway toward the corner where the noise of the building quieted, and I could finally breathe without feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of expectation. And I dialed my son's number, needing to hear his voice, needing to ask him directly if he was all right, if something had happened, if someone had pressured him into pushing this transfer so urgently. But when the call rang once, then went silent, then clicked straight to voicemail, my chest tightened in a way that sent a pulse of coldness down my spine, because he never sent me to voicemail, never ignored. Calls from me never left my voice unanswered unless someone else had told him to. And I tried again, but the same thing happened. Ring, faint silence, voicemail, and the hallway blurred for a moment as a memory rushed forward. The last time I saw, before this meeting, the way he kept checking his phone, the way he tensed whenever a message came in, the way he looked at her before responding to anything. I asked the way his answers felt filtered, shaped, guided by something I couldn't see, and I remembered the dinner where she spoke more than he did, the way she leaned subtly toward him whenever I questioned something, the way she rested her hand lightly on his arm each time he faltered, as if reminding him of whatever script she had rehearsed with him beforehand. And I remembered the moment I first felt the flicker of unease, that I refused to acknowledge, the way her smile tightened whenever I mentioned anything about the company, as if she were calculating, measuring, assessing the size of what could to become hers through him, if she played her part right. And now, with each unanswered call, each echo of the warning message, the truth became clearer. The urgency wasn't his, the pressure wasn't his, the need to finalize this today wasn't his, the voice pushing him forward wasn't his, and the realization settled over me like cold water draining down my spine. He wasn't leading anything, he was being led, and I knew I needed answers, answers he was not free to give, answers I could not get from him directly. So I dialed his assistant, someone who had known him long enough to recognize when something was off, and the tremor in her voice when she answered confirmed every fear racing through my mind, because she told me he had been different for weeks, distant, short-tempered, distracted, constantly checking his messages, missing meetings, reacting with uncharacteristic panic whenever she asked about deadlines that never used to bother him, and when he asked where he was. Now she hesitated long enough that my stomach dropped before saying he had left earlier with her. The woman always at his side, the woman who spoke for him more than he spoke for himself, and she didn't know where they went, but she said there was something in his expression, something brittle, something like fear, and that word hit me harder than the warning text, because my son had never looked afraid of business, never looked afraid of leadership, never looked afraid of stepping into responsibility. But fear around her was different. Fear around her meant she held something tightly inside him, something he didn't want me to see. And as I ended the call, my hands shook, not with anger, but with the clarity that comes when denial, finally, breaks under the weight of truth. And I remembered the way he wanted. This meeting rushed, the way he insisted. Everything needed to happen today. The way she had hovered behind him during the last discussion about the future, as if shielding him from my questions, as if pushing him toward an outcome she needed more than he did. And an image rose in my mind, uninvited him, sitting across from me weeks earlier. Eyes tired, shoulders heavy, voice cracking just slightly when he said he wanted to lead, wanted to prove himself, wanted to show he was ready. But the words felt hollow, as if someone had placed them inside him, not because they fit him, but because they served a purpose for someone else. And now, with the message burning through my thoughts and the pieces aligning, despite my refusal to see them earlier, I understood what that purpose was. She saw opportunity, saw wealth, saw a kingdom she could control if she held tightly enough to the one person with access to it. And she had wrapped herself around his insecurities, his need to be seen, his fear of disappointing people, until he couldn't tell where his thoughts ended and her influence began. And I leaned against the wall, gripping the edge of the window frame, until the pressure in my chest settled enough for me to breathe. Because the truth had finally spread through every corner of me. The son was not ready, not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked talent, but because he lacked freedom. He was tangled in someone else's grip, someone who didn't love him, someone who didn't support him, someone who wanted what he could deliver, not who he was. And if I signed those papers now, I wouldn't be handing the company to my son. I would be handing it to the person pulling his strings. And as that realization hardened inside me, the fear transformed into something steadier, something older, something fierce, the protective instinct that once drove me to hold his tiny hand as he learned to walk, the instinct that kept me standing between him and everything that threatened him, the instinct that told me, no matter what it cost, I would not let someone use him to claim what he didn't understand. He was giving away, and I lifted the phone again, staring at the cold glow of the warning message, still sitting on the screen. And though I didn't know who had sent it, I felt gratitude claw its way through the shock, because someone out there had seen something, someone had cared enough to intervene, someone had watched him walk into danger and tried to stop him. And I wondered who it was, someone close, someone observant, someone he must have trusted once. And I knew I needed to find out, but that wasn't the first step. The first step was protecting him, protecting everything, protecting the future, that he might still grow strong enough to handle. And I turned away from the boardroom, pale light spilling across the carpet as I made the decision with a clarity sharper than anything I'd felt in years. I would not sign, I would not surrender. I would not give her the power she wanted. Not through him, not through manipulation, not through urgency disguised as ambition. And as I walked down the hallway toward the elevator, one thought repeated in my mind like a pulse, steady, cold, immovable. I will not lose my son to someone who sees him as a tool, and I will not let him destroy himself to prove he is worthy of her. I spent the rest of the day moving through the house like someone walking across thin ice, every sound too loud, every shadow too sharp, because now that the truth had finally cracked open inside me, I couldn't unsee the patterns I had ignored. For months, the rushed conversations, the way he barely met my eyes, the constant tension in his shoulders, the way her presence always sharpened the air, the way each decision he made seemed driven not by confidence, but by fear, fear of losing her, fear of disappointing her, fear of being told again that he wasn't enough. And that night, I sat alone at the dining table, staring at the untouched dinner in front of me, the cold quiet of the house pressing in from every corner, and I kept replaying our last moments together, the way he insisted everything needed to happen today, the way he trembled slightly when I asked if he had thought everything through, the way he said she believed in him more than anyone ever had, the way his voice cracked when he said this was his only chance. And the more I replayed it, the more I realized his desperation hadn't come from ambition, it came from survival, because someone had convinced him that without this, transfer without proving himself in this moment, he would lose everything, including her. And around midnight, the phone lit up again, his name flashing across the screen. And before I even answered, I knew exactly how the conversation would go. The panic, the pressure, the urgency, because all of it had become familiar melodies in the symphony of manipulation she had wrapped around him. And when I picked up, his voice poured through the line, already panicked, already defensive, already trembling, as he asked why I walked out, asked why I hesitated, asked why I didn't trust him. And I tried to explain, tried to steady my voice, tried to tell him I simply needed time. But he didn't listen, or maybe he couldn't listen because her voice had already filled the space where his judgment should have lived. And he said she was upset, said she felt disrespected, said she thought I didn't take him seriously, said she believed I wanted to keep him small. And when I told him that none of that was true, he didn't answer, because I could hear her whispering in the background, the faint hiss of someone feeding lines to someone drowning, and he repeated everything she said word for word, as if he didn't know the difference between his own thoughts and hers anymore. And eventually the call cut off abruptly, leaving me holding the phone, staring into the dark, feeling something inside me fracture even deeper. And the next morning, I woke with the same dread lodged in my chest, and even before I reached the kitchen, I already knew the day would not pass without confrontation, and the house felt heavier, almost suffocating, and I moved slowly to the table, sitting down without really thinking, as if my body already knew to brace itself. And not long after, a car screeched to a stop outside, the sound loud enough to rattle the windows, and the front door swung open, and he rushed in, breathing, hard face, flushed eyes wild, and I knew instantly someone had triggered him, pushed him, cornered him, frightened him. And he paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, the same repetitive, frantic motion of a man trying to force thoughts back into his head, thoughts that someone else had shaken loose. And he said, she told him I was sabotaging him, that I was jealous of his potential, that I didn't want him to succeed, that I wanted to keep everything for myself. And each word tore through me, not because it hurt, but because it wasn't his voice, it wasn't his belief, it wasn't his judgment. It was hers, sharpened by her insecurities, sharpened by her hunger, sharpened by her desire to claim a throne she didn't build. And as he kept pacing, his breaths grew faster, shorter, more uneven, until he looked like someone trapped in a burning room searching for a window that wasn't there. And I stepped toward him slowly, gently, trying not to provoke him, trying not to push him deeper into the panic she had induced. And I asked him what he wanted, truly, not what she wanted, not what she convinced him he wanted, but what he wanted. And he froze, breath hitching, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting her to appear any second. And I saw it. Then the war inside him, the pull of loyalty, the fear of abandonment, the confusion of being torn between the parent who raised him and the woman who held his, insecurities like reins. And he said he didn't know. He said he was overwhelmed. He said he couldn't think clearly. He said everything felt like pressure pushing in from all sides. He said she was demanding he make a choice. He said she needed an answer, he said she told him. Hesitation meant failure. And he sank onto the couch, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with the weight of it all. And I sat beside him, quietly letting the silence settle, letting him breathe, letting him feel something without her interference. And after a moment, whispered that she told him he was running out of time, that the opportunity wouldn't wait, that investors were watching, that people would think he was incompetent if he didn't act fast, that she couldn't build a life with someone who second-guessed everything. And hearing that made my entire body go cold, because I knew what she was doing. She wasn't pushing him toward success, she was pushing him toward desperation. Desperation she could use to control him, desperation she could use to isolate him, desperation she could use to force him to choose her over everyone else. And when I placed a hand gently on his arm, he looked up at me with eyes full of fear and exhaustion, and he whispered that he felt like he was drowning and she was the only one offering him a rope. And I told him softly, painfully, honestly, that a rope can also be a leash, and his breath hitched, because he knew I was right. And right in that moment she walked in without knocking, without hesitation, standing in my doorway as if she owned the air inside the house, and she marched straight toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back into her orbit, and he straightened immediately, panic flashing across his face, as if her arrival demanded immediate obedience. And she asked in that smooth, controlled voice if I had changed my mind, if I was ready to sign, if I had finally realized what a good opportunity this was and when. I didn't answer right away. Her expression tightened just slightly enough for me to see the irritation simmer underneath, and she launched into a flawless speech. About legacy, about progress, about trust. Her words polished and practiced and poisoned, and when I tried to speak she talked over me seamlessly, as if my voice held no importance, as if my home wasn't mine, as if my son's future was already hers to command. And he sat there, torn between us, eyes darting, back and forth, hands trembling, breath shallow, and I knew then the moment had come, the moment she feared, and I dreaded the moment she realized I wasn't going to bend, and he wasn't going to break, and the fury that shadowed her face told me. She understood that her puppet strings were loosening, and her control was slipping, and her voice sharpened. Her accusations escalated, and he flinched at every word, until finally he whispered that he needed space, he needed time, he needed air, he needed silence. And she glared at him as if he had betrayed her entirely, and she yanked him toward the door, pulling him away from me as if separating us. Physically would restore the hold she was losing, and he followed. Her not because he chose her, but because he was too exhausted to resist, too worn down to fight, too tangled in her emotional chains to stand still. And when the door slammed shut behind them, the entire house sank into a silence so deep, rang in my ears, and I stood there understanding with a clarity that almost buckled my knees that this would not end gently, that the truth was finally pushing its way through the lies, and that soon, very soon, something irreversible would break. The next morning I woke before the sun fully broke through the windows, and for a moment everything looked still enough to fool me into believing the nightmare from yesterday hadn't really happened. But then the heaviness in my ribs reminded me exactly where I was standing in the middle of a storm that had already begun tearing pieces off my son piece by piece, and the house felt colder than usual, not from temperature but from the absence of certainty, and I moved slowly through the kitchen, touching the counter, touching the back of the chair, touching anything that might anchor me, because a part of me already sensed the day would not pass without something breaking. And when the phone finally lit up again, his name flashing across the screen, I knew what was coming before I even answered. The frantic, breathless rush of words, the tremble under every sentence, the pressure coating his voice like a film. And he said she hadn't slept, said she was furious, said she was questioning everything, said she threatened to walk out if he didn't handle the situation. Today said that I had insulted her, said that I had humiliated him, said that I was sabotaging him, said that I wanted to control everything, and each accusation landed the way her accusations always did, not as truth, but as weapons, tailored to cut him exactly where he was weakest, and I could picture him pacing somewhere, phone in hand, eyes wild, shoulders tight, while she hovered behind him, pushing him, whispering, urging him to repeat every line she fed him, and I listened quietly, letting him spill everything, letting him empty out the panic she had poured into him, because interrupting him would only drive him deeper into her shadow. And when he finally paused long enough to breathe, I asked again the question he could never answer without flinching, "What do you want?" And he didn't speak, not because he didn't hear me, but because he didn't know anymore, and the silence that followed was long enough for me to hear the truth echo through it. He had lost the line between his voice and hers. And right when he finally drew a shaky breath, the sharp triple knock hit the door, loud, sudden, jarring enough to slice straight through his panic, and I told him quietly, "I need to call you back." And when I opened the door, she was standing there with that same too bright, polished smile, the kind of smile that doesn't belong to sincerity, but to someone preparing for battle. And she didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight in, heels hitting the floor with precision, her eyes sweeping the room as if checking whether anything had changed since the last time she barged into this house, and she started speaking before the door even closed behind her, her voice warm on the surface, but edged with something cold underneath, saying she didn't understand yesterday, saying she felt disrespected, saying she knew my son deserved more, saying she wanted us all to move forward together, saying there shouldn't be secrets between family, and she sat down so deliberately she could have been claiming territory, and folded her hands as if she were the reasonable one, and I stood there watching her, watching the subtle twitch in her jaw, watching the calculation in her eyes, watching the way her voice softened exactly at the points she wanted to appear vulnerable, and it would have fooled someone who didn't know what manipulation looked like, but I wasn't someone who could be fooled anymore. And when I asked her calmly why everything suddenly needed to happen, now, why all the pressure, why all the urgency, she didn't hesitate. She had an answer prepared. Said, opportunity. Didn't wait, said the world. Rewarded the decisive, said, my hesitance was damaging, said my son. Was suffering because of my fear. And when I told her I wanted time, she leaned forward sharply, her voice tightening as she said, time was the problem, hesitation was the problem, I was the problem, and every sentence she delivered was wrapped in false concern, but sharpened with implied threat. And just then my son walked in, through the still half-open door, breathless eyes, already wide, with that same panic I had heard over the phone, and the moment he saw her, he straightened like someone pulling a mask back onto their face, and she turned to him with a smile that dropped. The second she faced away from him, and she placed a hand on his arm, squeezing lightly in, that same way she always did when she wanted him to speak for her. And like clockwork, he repeated everything she had said: urgency, pressure, disrespect, humiliation, opportunity, slipping. The same script said, with the same cadence and the same tremble underneath, and I watched him closely, not the words, but the man behind them, the way he swallowed too hard, the way his fingers twitched, the way he kept glancing at her, as if checking whether he was saying the right things, and something inside me cracked the way thin ice cracks under a heavy boot, because I could see how deeply she had wrapped herself into his fear, how thoroughly she had convinced him that choosing anything but her was failure, and as he kept talking, his voice growing louder, his hands shaking harder, she just watched him unravel, watched him draw deeper into panic, watched him break himself open for her narrative, and she didn't reach out to comfort him, didn't try to calm him, didn't soothe him. She let him spin because spinning served. Her spinning made him easier to direct. Spinning made him dependent, and the moment I stepped forward and told him to breathe, to sit down, to slow his thoughts, she changed instantly, her face flattening, her voice sharpening as she accused me of undermining him, insulting him, belittling him. And he flinched visibly, because each time she said those things she wasn't attacking me, she was attacking the part of him that still trusted me. And I asked him, again, gently, painfully, what he truly wanted, and he looked at me with trembling eyes and whispered, I don't know anymore. And that single sentence pierced deeper than anything else had, because it wasn't confusion, it was loss. He had lost himself, somewhere between her demands and his fears, and he didn't even know when it happened, and she heard it too, because her expression hardened. She stood abruptly, pulling him up with her, gripping his wrist in that subtle, too-tight way that looked affectionate to strangers and controlling to anyone paying attention, and she told him they were leaving, told him this environment was toxic, told him I was not manipulating him, told him I was trying to sabotage his future, told him we couldn't continue this conversation until I was ready to respect him, and he followed her, not because he chose her, but because she didn't give him room, not physically, not emotionally, not mentally. She pulled and he went, because he didn't know how to stay without being torn open again. And as they reached the doorway, she turned, looking back at me with that cold, victorious smile, as if she believed she had finally secured him fully and completely, and when the door closed, the house fell into a silence, so thick it pressed against my chest. And I stood there alone, feeling something settle inside me, something heavy and irreversible. The understanding that she was not going to stop until she got what she wanted, and the only way to save him would be to make a choice. He would hate a choice that would break something between us, a choice that would cost me the last pieces of peace I had left, but a choice I could no longer avoid, because the storm was no longer coming. The storm was already here. The house stayed unnervingly quiet the rest of that day, a kind of silence that didn't feel natural but deliberate, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment everything shattered, and I moved through each room, trying to settle the storm inside me. But the dread kept curling higher in my chest because I knew she wouldn't let things end where they had. She wouldn't accept hesitation. She wouldn't accept boundaries. She wouldn't accept anything that didn't fulfill the outcome she had been manipulating toward for months. And by evening I found myself sitting at the table with my hands braced against the edge, breathing slowly, trying to steady the weight pressing beneath my ribs. but it kept tightening the longer I sat there because every memory of her words, every echo of her accusations, every tremor in my son's voice kept replaying through my mind until it felt like the walls were tilting inward, and I knew what I had to do, not because I wanted to, not because it felt fair, not because it felt like love, but because every instinct inside me screamed that if I didn't act now, she would take everything through him, and he would let her without even knowing he was losing himself in the process. And that thought alone was enough to twist something deep inside my chest, and I stood abruptly moving toward the office, where the old locked drawer sat heavy with documents. I never wanted to touch this soon, and I retrieved the folder, hands trembling slightly as I placed it on the desk, the weight of the decision already settling into my bones, and I opened each file slowly, reading through every line of every agreement, every clause, every contingency, and the truth became painfully clear. Signing over the company now would not be giving my son a future. It would be handing her a weapon and trusting her not to fire it, and my hands tightened the paper, bending under my grip, because I knew she wouldn't hesitate. She wouldn't blink. She would use him as a shield, as a tool, as an excuse to pull everything she could from me until there was nothing left but the shell of what used to be my legacy, and once she had what she wanted, she would simply move on, leaving him shattered, confused, abandoned, and too broken to understand how he had helped destroy everything he was meant to inherit. And the sickening ache in my chest deepened because I could see it so clearly now. The version of my son she was molding, not strong, not confident, not independent, but hollowed out, obedient, desperate for her approval, chasing goals that weren't his, drowning in expectations he never agreed to. And I told myself over and over I had to choose the harder path, the one he would resent, the one he would misunderstand, the one she would turn into the ultimate betrayal, because doing nothing would mean watching him be devoured, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the boy I raised, nothing left of the man he could have become. And I sat there in that dim room with the document open in front of me, the line for my signature, staring back like a precipice, and I reached for the pen slowly, deliberately, feeling the finality of the moment settle into my bones, and I began signing the papers that would dismantle the entire transfer, locking every major asset behind legal walls so high and so complex that not even my son, not even she, could force their way through them. And the moment the final signature dried, I felt a pressure ease inside me and another kind rise in its place, grief, a deep, steady ache that kept growing because I knew exactly what this decision would cost me. I knew exactly what she would do when she found out. I knew exactly what he would believe when she filled his head with the story she was about to twist. And not long after I finished the last form, my phone lit up, ringing with a sharpness that made my stomach twist. And when I saw his name, I closed my eyes slowly, exhaling because I already knew the tone I would hear. I answered, and the fury hit immediately. Not cold, not calculated, but frantic, chaotic, threaded with hurt and confusion and accusation. And he asked me what I had done, demanded to know why the accounts were frozen, why the lawyers had been informed, why the promisor, the transfer, was blocked, why the board had been alerted, and each word crashed into me like a wave. But I didn't speak, not yet, because underneath all that rage I could hear the tremor, the fear, the panic, the sound of a man who had been told his entire future was stolen and had no idea he'd been manipulated into believing it. And he said she was devastated, said she felt betrayed, said she couldn't believe I would sabotage him, said she was questioning everything, said she didn't know if she could stay with someone whose own father didn't trust him, and that last part cut sharper than the rest, because I could hear how deeply she had carved her influence into him, how tightly she had stitched herself into his sense of identity, how completely she had convinced him that any challenge to her was an attack on him. And when he finally stopped for breath, demanding an explanation, I spoke quietly, slowly, choosing every word with the weight of a truth he wasn't ready to hear. I told him I did what I did to protect him, protect everything, protect our legacy, protect the future. He couldn't see through the shadow she cast over him, and he laughed, a broken, angry laugh, asking how locking everything away was protection, asking why I thought fear was a reason to strip him of opportunity, asking what right I had to decide his future. And I told him as gently as I could that he wasn't thinking clearly, that someone was using him, that someone had been shaping his decisions, that someone had replaced his confidence with dependence, and he fell silent, the kind of silence that feels physical, heavy, crushing, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper, shaking with something raw and wounded. He asked me if I really believed he couldn't lead, if I really believed he was weak, if I really believed he needed to be saved. And hearing that nearly broke me, because he didn't understand, not yet, not fully, that none of this was about him, not the boy I raised, not the man he could become, but about the grip she had around him, the grip I had watched tighten day after day until his words no longer sounded like his, and I told him I believed in him too much to let someone else use him to dismantle his own future, and he didn't respond, just breathed hard into the phone like he was fighting something inside himself, something that didn't want to break. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had shifted, gone quieter, gone colder, gone hollow, in a way that pierced straight through me. He said he needed time, said he needed space, said he didn't know if he could look at me right now, said she was devastated, said everything was ruined, and then he hung up, leaving nothing but the echo of his breath still, trembling inside my chest, and I sat there in the dim room, feeling the weight of everything I had done, and everything still coming, pressing down, until it felt hard to breathe. But beneath the sorrow, beneath the ache, beneath the dread of what tomorrow would bring, one thing stayed steady inside me. I had saved him even if he didn't know it yet. The hours after that call felt like walking through a house filled with ghosts, shadows of every conversation I ever had with him, drifting through the rooms, brushing past me with a coldness I couldn't escape, and I kept hearing his voice, the tremble beneath the anger, the hurt beneath the accusations, the confusion that spilled out between his words like water leaking through cracked stone. And I knew he wasn't really angry at me. He was angry at the collapse of the fantasy she had built around him, the fantasy she convinced him he needed to survive, the fantasy she made him believe she was the only one who could help him reach. And now, with one decision, one signature, I had wrenched him out of her orbit. So suddenly, he didn't know how to stand on his own legs, and the silence in the house was thick enough to press against my ribs, and hours passed before I heard the knock, not loud, not furious, but timid, hesitant, like someone unsure they had the right to stand on the other side of the door. And when I opened it, he was there, shoulders slumped, eyes red, face drained of the fierce certainty he had worn like armor the last few weeks, and he stepped inside without speaking, moving toward the living room like his legs were carrying him out of habit rather than intention, and he sat down heavily, pressing his palms together, breathing slowly as if every inhale hurt. And I didn't speak, I didn't move, I just sat across from him, letting the quiet settle, letting him find his footing, because rushing him now would only push him back into her shadow. And after a long, trembling breath, he looked up, and his voice came out hoarse, almost broken, as he said, "She left," and I felt the words sink straight into my bones, because even without the details, I already knew what she had said, what she had done, what weapons she used, as she walked out, and he stared down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, whispering that she told him he was useless, told him he had embarrassed her, told him he had failed her, told him he had chosen the wrong side, told him she couldn't be with someone whose father didn't respect her, told him all her dreams were ruined because of him, told him she didn't want a man who let his father control him. And as he spoke, his voice cracked, shattered, collapsed, and he pressed his hand over his mouth, trying to stop the sobs rising in his throat, but they came anyway, small, broken sounds that shook his entire body, and I moved slowly, sitting beside him, not touching him, but close enough for him to feel I wasn't going anywhere, and he whispered that she packed everything she owned, without looking at him, that she told him not to call, not to follow, not to expect her return, that she needed someone stronger, someone who didn't question her, someone who didn't make her feel like she was carrying both their futures alone. And hearing those words tore through me, because I could see so clearly what he couldn't see. Yet she never loved him. She loved what he could give her, and the second that door closed, she had no use for him anymore. And he kept whispering, "I don't know who I am without her." And the pain in that confession nearly buckled me, because I remembered the child he used to be, the laughter, the stubbornness, the spark, the curiosity, and now sitting in front of me was a man who had given so much of himself away, he didn't know how to separate his identity from the woman who dismantled it. And I told him quietly that grief from manipulation feels like grief from love, but they are not the same. One grows you, one ruins you. And he nodded slowly, tears still falling as he whispered, I think she hated me, and I shook my head because she didn't hate him. Hatred requires emotional investment. She used him, and when use ran out she left, and he bowed his head, arms wrapped around himself as if trying to hold all the pieces in place as they fell apart, and I let him cry long, quiet, suffocating sobs that came from a place too deep for words, and when he finally ran out of breath he leaned back against the couch, letting his head fall back, eyes closed, face streaked with grief and exhaustion, and he whispered, I don't understand how I let this happen. And I told him gently that people who know how to wound the insecure don't need force, they need whispers and timing, and she had used both with precision. She fed his doubt, fed his fear, fed his longing to be seen, until he mistook her control for guidance and her ambition for love. And he nodded slowly as if each word peeled back a layer to a fog, and after a long silence he opened his eyes again, staring at the ceiling, and whispered the question I knew had been waiting inside him for weeks. Do you hate me? And the ache that had been pressing in my chest broke open, because that was the wound she had carved deepest. She made him believe his worth was conditional, fragile, easily revoked, and I told him quietly that I never hated him, that I never would, that my anger had never been for him, only for the way he was being twisted into someone who couldn't see his own reflection clearly, and he turned his head toward me, eyes puffy, voice thin, and asked, Can you ever trust me again? And I breathed slowly, letting the answer come from the places inside me that still remembered holding him as a child, the weight of him against my chest, the warmth of his small hand in mine, and I told him trust can be rebuilt, but not overnight, and he nodded slowly, accepting the truth, even though it hurt, because he wasn't looking for comfort, he was looking for honesty. And the room settled into a heavy quiet as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers tangled in, his hair whispering, I need to start over, and I felt something like hope flicker quietly in the deepest part of me, because those words were not hers, they were his, raw, trembling, unpolished, but his, and he said he didn't know where to begin, didn't know who he was anymore, didn't know how to rebuild after breaking so completely, and I told him the only thing I could, the only thing that mattered, you begin by choosing yourself, not her, not me, not the company. Taught yourself. And he let out a shaky breath, nodding slowly, as if the idea felt foreign but freeing. And we sat in the dimming room, the light fading across the floor, the silence no longer suffocating but settling, and after a long time, he whispered, Thank you, not for the money, not for the company, not for the decisions I made, but for being here when she wasn't. And when he finally stood to leave, he looked steadier, still wounded, still raw, but steadier, and he said he needed time to think, needed time to heal, needed time to separate his voice from hers, and as I watched him walk out the door, I felt something shift inside me. The storm that had been circling for months finally beginning to disperse, leaving behind debris but also space. Space for him to rebuild without the weight of someone who wanted to own him. Space for me to breathe without fear of losing him. Space for a future that could finally belong to him again. And when the house settled back into silence, I let my eyes close, the ache still there but softened, because for the first time in a long time, he was walking toward himself, not away, and that was enough.